Hello and welcome to day 3, I think, of this here CanWeek. We are going to be talking about The Virgin Cure by Amy McKay. As you may or may not recall, The Birth House by Amy McKay was one of my favorite books of 2015, and I in no way expected this book to really compare to that. However, I did enjoy it. The book is set in 1871 in Lower Manhattan, particularly in Lower Christie Street, which is like a really impoverished area at the time. And we're following Moth, who is a young girl and the daughter of what's described in the book as a gypsy fortune teller, but she's basically an Eastern European immigrant. Moth's mother ends up essentially selling her into a housekeeping job for a wealthy woman. It's really terrible. She ends up escaping, and then she ends up in this area called the Bowery, and she ends up in a brothel run by someone named Miss Everett. And it's a very specific institution or establishment where Miss Everett takes in young virginal girls and basically grooms them into being sex workers based on the assumption that they are like desired virgins. While Moth is living and training at this brothel, she also meets Dr. Sadie, who is a physician at the time, and Dr. Sadie specifically works with sex workers, with victims of assault, and with people who aren't able to afford medical care. The reason I think I enjoyed this book as much as I did was because through what I have studied about the history of sexuality, I was very familiar with the specific sexual geography of New York City at this time. Even going back to the title, The Virgin Cure, that's coming from this very popular dominant notion during this time in the United Kingdom as well as in North America, that if a man who had a STI, mostly gonorrhea, I'm not sure why, but if he had sex with a virgin or someone who hasn't had sex before, also by sex in this case we're meaning like P&V penetration. Also, virginity isn't real. It's a patriarchal construct. This led to the subsequent sex work or selling girls into this kind of work or assault and rape of lots of young women as well as women with disabilities because of assumptions about not being sexually active, as well as children and infants. The first aspect of the specific landscape and geography of sexuality is race, specifically because like whiteness isn't a natural category. Whiteness has always been a socially constructed category with a lot of violence and struggle behind it, and a lot of groups like Irish people, Eastern European immigrants, engaging in anti-blackness as well as other forms of racism to be able to move up into whiteness. At this time, Moth and her mother were not considered to be properly white, and there are specific areas of exoticization that Moth experiences when she becomes a sex worker or when she becomes involved in sex work, when she's not necessarily working at the brothel either, kind of at the end of the book when she finds her new career path. What I did really appreciate about what Amy McKay does in this book is that she is telling an alternate account of history in this specific area. She is naming a lot of the things that don't get accounted for in dominant narratives of history. One of them being the rise of very specific institutions which coincided with the construction of the child. One of the things that Moth has to encounter after she's escaped from her housekeeping job, there were very specific institutions that were starting to be created and established at this time that were promoting very specific kinds of rhetoric around safeguarding children, because children until like around this time were not necessarily thought of being these like pure precious beings that need to be safeguarded, right? Particularly all these like religious based institutions. So they weren't quite orphanages, they were like specific kinds of homes for like street involved youth essentially. They were using very specific racialized rhetoric, more so to do in what's covered in this book with not correct forms of whiteness as well as class and gender. So there was this idea that all of these children were out on the streets and they were either being involved in like crime if they were boys, or they were victims of crime if they were girls, and we needed to save all of these children, bring them into these institutions. However, a lot of children who ended up in these institutions unfortunately experienced higher rates of abuse and violence because in the institution they were subject to authority figures. Even though this book specifically focuses on young women, one of the aspects that I was reading into this and considering as the story was unfolding is the fact that lots of boys and young men also worked as sex workers, and yet we never hear about it. So at the time when there's this tension between this new idea of the pure innocent child who must be protected, there's also children who are working, particularly in working class families, who were expected to participate in the family economy in some way. One of the most lucrative ways to contribute to the family, especially if you were like a boy, a young man, was through sex work with older men. That's a very simplistic look, but the point is there are so many things going on in this landscape of sexuality and sex work and economies in general, and this book covered some of it. What I do appreciate about it is that Amy McKay, is giving agency to young women sex workers, which is not something that happens often, because there really tends to be these dominant ideas of victimization and victimhood that is assumed. The one thing I am still unsure of, and I think I need to look up and research more, is whether or not rape was used as a plot device. I'm still not sure how I'm feeling about that, and so content warning for the story. That was The Virgin Cure by Amy McKay. I have picked up The Witches of New York, which is a loose-ish continuation of The Virgin Cure. Moth is one of the central characters, I believe, so you will see that in a upcoming CanWeek, something of that sort situation.